Okay, now let's go into the analysis of F53. The standard view, as I mentioned it, of F53 is Friedman's instrumentalism. So, I mean, many people haven't read Friedman, but many people have the opinion, yes, Friedman, that's the instrumentalism in economics, period, right? And he's just the instrumentalist. And Mäki puts it that way, that is what I said already, even outrageously unrealistic assumptions are just fine insofar as the theory or model involving them performs well in predicting phenomena of interest. And that really sounds somehow like Friedman, but honestly, it is not really Friedman. It's really badly misleading, as we shall see. The contrary to that sort of instrumentalism is realism. And that realism claims that hypotheses or theories are true or approximately true of reality. Right? That is two different positions, instrumentalism versus realism. I come back to it in a little more detail later at the appropriate locus. And then many people agree that F53 is difficult to read because there are supposedly many obscurities, ambiguities, and even inconsistencies. So there is very harsh criticism of this paper. And, well, we'll see. Well, the paper is badly written, but I show you exactly where that is. Now, the outline now of this section, 5.2, is first I want to list some irritating statements in 53 and strange facts about F53. Then I ask the question whether that's an instrumentalist position. And then I ask the question, what are F53's assumptions in scarce quotes? Then I make a connection to Weber's ideal types. Weber doesn't occur there, no citation of Weber. Max Weber, the sociologist, one of the three founding fathers of sociology, Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, a very important guy. Then there is a connection to Popper's philosophy. Popper never cited, but there is a connection, we'll see, finally. And then I ask again the question, is F53 really an instrumentalist position? And then we have learned something, and then we can answer this question. And then we revisit the irritating statements and facts. The point is that if you claim that you understand Friedman, then you must make sense of these irritating statements and strange facts. Otherwise, your theory about what is in that or your understanding is deficient. And I test what I'm saying by then revisiting them and at the end a conclusion. Now here are the irritating statements in and strange facts about F53. It's just a list of facts when you read it. So the first says, in short, positive economics is or can be an objective science in precisely the same sense as any of the physical sciences. Now this is of course a little strange because he says objective and then he says in precisely the same sense. Yeah, but what is the sense of objective in scare quotes? Right. Then the next thing, the term assumptions, I've counted it, occurs 73 times in F53, but 37 times, 50% in scare quotes. Scare quotes mean you distance you. It's not a citation. Scare quotes is you distance yourself somehow from the term, right? When you use a term in scare quotes, you say, yeah, I'm using the term, but I don't really mean what the term says. I mean something else, right? But the problem is you're not explaining what you mean unless you explain it, but he never does, right? So he uses scare quotes, but doesn't explain what. So you don't really know, and it's important to him, right? So he uses it 37 times on something like once a page in average, right? In scare quotes. So it's important to him, the scare quotes, in section titles, but you don't know what that means. So there are many other terms in F53 that occur in scare quotes. For instance, objective science, correct economic policy, language, explain, reality, realism, real-world facts. And that makes, of course, F53 a very hard reading because he always tells us, look, I'm using this term, but I don't mean it. You know, I mean something else, roughly only. But he doesn't explain what he means. So how can you understand what's going on? It's very, very, very hard. And I know it because I really spent much time with that damn article. Okay. So next thing. Here, truly, and I mentioned a truly important and significant hypothesis will be found to have assumptions in scare quotes, right, that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality, and in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. In this sense, in what sense, for Christ's sake? In what sense? He says assumptions with scare quotes, and then he says, in this sense, but I don't know which sense you mean, right? So, and then you're saying, and then, I mean, people said this is crazy. The more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. Isn't that credible? I mean, isn't he completely over the board? Many people thought so. Okay. And then this other, again, very difficult sentence, the basic confusion between descriptive accuracy and analytic relevance that underlies most criticism of economic theory on the grounds that its assumptions are unrealistic. So he says people who criticize economics are usually confusing descriptive accuracy and analytic relevance. And how can I have a false, how can something that's really false analytically relevant? Come on, explain that to me in more detail. All right. And then here's also I mentioned that a fundamental hypothesis of science is that appearances are deceptive and that there's a way of looking at or interpreting or organizing the evidence that will reveal superficially disconnected and diverse phenomena to be manifestation of a much more fundamental and relatively simple structure. Now, you may buy that and say, oh yes, this is like in physics in the 17th century. But the point is, isn't he an instrumentalist? Right? And an instrumentalist doesn't find fundamental simple structures. An instrumentalist uses a theory as an instrument and doesn't refer to, wow, this theory gives us deep insights in a relatively simple underlying structure. That's completely inconsistent with instrumentalism. It doesn't work at all. But he says that. So is he really an instrumentalist? That sounds like a full realist, right? A theory are wonderful because they tell you the secrets, right, of nature or whatever, or economics, of the economy here. He speaks like a realist here. So how does that go with together with the instrumentalist stuff? And there are many Popper topics in 53. So if you know something a little about Popper, there are many there. And the question is, why is that? Why does he use them? Well, why doesn't he cite them? But they're there, many of them. Okay. So these are the strange things. And if anyone who claims that he or she has understood what Friedman is after, this person should be able to make sense of these very strange statements and facts and give an explanation what is going on there. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do. Okay. All right. So the first question is whether F53's position is instrumentalist. And again, instrumentalism evaluates theories solely on and hypotheses solely on the basis of their predictive power. And predictions are statements derived from the theory, not necessarily for the future. So you judge, an instrumentalist says, look, a theory, a hypothesis is just an instrument. And to judge the quality of that instrument, it's only useful to look whether it produces good theories, good predictions. In this view, theories are instruments for prediction, neither true nor false, like scissors. Right? If you want to judge whether a scissor is a good instrument, you cannot ask, is this scissor true? Doesn't make sense. Is it approximately true? Completely wrong question. But you can say, does it really cut paper if it's a scissor made for paper cutting, right? That is the point. So you judge it, the instruments, does it fulfill its aim, right? And if it's a scissor for thin metal, is it capable of cutting thin metal plates or is it not, right? So you judge an instrument only by its function. And the question whether it's true or false is a categorically false question. You cannot ask this question. It doesn't make sense to ask the question. So this is what instrumentalism says. So it says the theories are solely judged on the basis of their predictive power. You cannot even ask whether they are true or false. Realism, the counterposition, is much more ambitious. Realism said theories should be approximately true. So what the theory says about the world, right? What it says about the world, the entities in the world or whatever, what it says about the world should be approximately true. And their approximate truth is usually derived from their empirical success. And this possibility instrumentalists deny. right? So the instrumentalists say, look, whether a theory makes good prediction is fine, but it remains an instrument. And the realist goes farther and says, if a theory is really very, very good in its prediction, then it must be somehow true. Right? And that's a deep conviction of many people. If a theory is really good in its empirical predictions, it can only be because it's fundamentally somehow true. This is what the realists believe, and the instrumentalists deny that. They say, no, there's no way how you can conclude from the quality or high quality of predictions to the truth of the theory or approximate truth. So that's a conflict in philosophy. Also partly in philosophy of physics also. So this is the point. Realists therefore believe that the entity successful theories refer to really exists. And the instrumentalists deny that. They say, we have no idea. Right? So you have a theory in which electrons are, for instance, right, in electrodynamics, and you use electrons and protons, and you say something about them. Then the instrumentalist says, I have no idea whether electrons or protons exist. But the theory is a good one because the predictions are very good. So I can predict how a cell phone works, the radio waves and blah, blah. Whereas the realist says, oh, this successful theory that uses electrons and protons, that's a good sign that electrons and protons really exist, at least approximately so what the theory claims. So that's the conflict. And one doesn't see immediately how that applies to economics. It's very, very obvious when you apply it to biology or physics, right? When you say, well, selection pressure exists and genetic variation exists for evolutionary theory, when you have evolutionary theory and it uses selective pressures and genetic variation, then you've got to say, oh, in nature there is genetic variation, and in nature there are selective pressures. That's what the theory says, right? An instrumentalist doesn't say, I have no idea what genetic variation is, I have no idea what selective pressure is, I judge evolutionary theory only by its predictions. And I don't care what the theory says about, what the world is like, what's in there. It's an instrument. Okay, it's a very radical position, but some people in science hold that position anyway. And now it's very important to see that realism and instrumentalism come in two different forms. As a global form and a local form, in the slang of philosophy of science, that's the wholesale version and the retail version. And that's important to see this difference. The local form of realism or instrumentalism concerns one particular theory. You have one theory, and then you ask the questions, are the entities the theory refers to, are they real or are they purely auxiliary, right? Just, practical as instruments. Here is an example, preferences. If you look at revealed preference theory, they are local instrumentalists, local concerning only preference theory. And they say, what are preferences? Well, a calculating device. Do preferences exist in the real world? No idea. They're calculating devices, right? What is real in the world is choices. We want to predict choices. We introduce as an auxiliary, we introduce the preferences. Whether they exist or not, we don't care, right? That's the instrumentalist. It's just an auxiliary quantity. Behavioral economists say preferences are real properties of human beings, and they are therefore local realists, right? They say, yes, people have preferences, and we can investigate them. They are real there in people, right? We can measure them. They are there. Whereas the revealed preference theory says, no idea. It's just something to calculate future choices. Right? There you see the difference. And that's local, meaning it only concerns one particular theory. Right? Now, in physics, it's often the case that a theory is first interpreted instrumentalistically and only later realistically. So the Copernican heliocentric system of planets by most people in the beginning was just interpreted as a calculational device to calculate the orbits of the planets. And people said, wonderful. We don't believe a word what the theory says, that the sun is at the center of the universe. Nonsense. The earth is at the center of the universe. But as a calculating device, it's very practical. It's a very practical instrument to predict something. And that happened in the beginning, and then only later people discovered, oh, wait a minute, that is real, that the sun is at the center. We have a similar situation concerning preferences. If you look at the 19th century theory, where they had something like preferences, of course they were psychologically investigated, right? This was pain avoidance and joy seeking. And they were, of course, in real people. And then what happened with after the Second World War with Samuelson and others, abstraction, right? Preference is something purely mathematical. So instrumentalism concerning preferences, earlier realism. And now we are going back to a realism of our preferences in behavioral theory and in neuroeconomics, right? So there's this motion, and that the important point is this is something absolutely normal in many sciences concerning one particular theory, right? So you may be a local instrumentalist or a local realist concerning one theory and the opposite regarding another theory. Right? So this is just concerning particular things, and scientists have to decide whether they are realists or instrumentalists concerning particular theories. Now the other thing is, and this is how in philosophy mostly realism and instrumentalism is discussed, it's called a global form of realism or instrumentalism, and that concerns all successful theories in the field. Right? So a global realist in physics interprets all successful theories in physics realistically. He says, yes, they describe really the world approximately truthfully, right? And a global instrumentalist says, I do not believe any theory in physics, what it says about the world. I only use these theories of instruments, right? This is the global view. This is the one that's usually discussed in philosophy of science, and also in philosophy of economics, and not the other form. The other form is more for the scientists. We have something similar here, like with inductive generalization, that the philosophers discuss a different problem than the problem related to it that the scientists discuss. And that's here the same. Scientists are typically interested in local forms. Can I interpret, in that case, or a more recent example that I was already born and studying physics when I saw it, a theory of quarks. So many people in the beginning said quarks don't exist, they're purely mathematical fictions. And then that changed, and now everyone in physics believes in quarks. Okay, so that's the local forms and the global forms of realism. And of course in F53, the global forms are the issue. Because Friedman does not talk about one particular theory and ask what sort of theory is that accurate, and so on, but he speaks about economic hypothesis in general. So what is at issue is F53 instrumentalist in the global sense, right? So this is the issue, but it's very important to get that clear. Well, this is what I said. F53 seems to support an instrumentalist position at many places. However, we should take seriously the following passage, this I mentioned already. Truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are widely inaccurate descriptive representation of reality, and in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. Why is that a problem? Well, note first that in this passage there are scare quotes around the term assumptions. So we have this problem that he said they found have assumptions. So what theories contain is thus something that is only misleadingly expressed by assumptions without scare quotes, but is somehow similar to assumptions in the usual sense. So they contain something, well, with some similarity to assumptions, but not really assumptions. What the hell is it? And he doesn't explain it, right? So you say, yeah, okay, fine, all right. So they concern assumptions. Wonderful. I don't know what they contain, right? Now, about these assumptions with scare quotes, Friedman says the following. In general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. in this sense. I mean, in this sense is almost ironical. I mean, you can't believe it. He doesn't say what it is, and then he said in that sense. Anyway, but this is what he says. The more unrealistic the assumptions. Now, this statement does not fit instrumentalism. That's very important. If you are an instrumentalist, you cannot say that. Why not? Instrumentalism passes no judgment on the character of assumptions, whatever they are. Whatever's in your theory, instrumentalism says, put in your theory whatever you want. I don't care. I only care about the predictions. So I don't judge the theory or parts of the theory as realistic or unrealistic. I have no judgment on it. That's not my way how I assess theories. So that is certainly not compatible with instrumentalism. So either Friedman is inconsistent, a little crazy or confused, but that is not instrumentalism, because you can't say that. You can say, I don't care about it, whether the assumptions are realistic or unrealistic, as an instrumentalist. You say, I don't care. All about I care about is the predictions of the theory. I don't care what you put into the theory. I only judge it by the result, right? Your predictions. So, but when he says, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic assumptions, that does not work with instrumentalism. Now, because instrumentalism assesses theory solely by the performance as instruments that produce predictions, but the passage does not seem to be compatible with realism either. Because why could it be a virtue of a theory to contain unrealistic assumptions, whatever they are? The realist wants to have theories that are approximately true about the world and are therefore capable of making good predictions. But the realist wants to have a realistic picture of the world, right? So a realist cannot say, oh, this is a wonderful theory because its assumptions are so unrealistic. That's not possible for a realist to say. That doesn't make sense, right? So that's very strange. Unrealistic assumptions seem to be at best tolerable in realism, but not laudable. Right? You may say for some reason, yeah, I accept this assumption is not okay, but they're not laudable. You cannot praise a theory because it has false assumptions. That's impossible for a realist. The realist wants to have a theory that represents the world approximately right. And if something is basically wrong, then as a realist you say, that's not, I want to have a theory that represents the world. I want to have a true picture approximately. But here he praises these unrealistic assumptions. So that's not compatible with realism either. So the problem is, if you really read that carefully, it's neither compatible with instrumentalism nor with realism. So this is, of course, very strange. So you may say, are there other possibilities? Doesn't look it. So is Friedman confused? Does he know what he's talking about? Well, let's see. Some authors have tried to understand what F53 means by these assumptions. Because it's not clear yet. I mean, what sort of things are these assumptions there, with these strange properties? And thereby inserting various possible meanings, but none of them worked. So Musgrave wrote this famous paper in 81, and he said, look, what could assumption mean? It could mean X, Y, Z, and then he puts it in there and reads the passages and says, doesn't make sense. So it seems to be that there is no possible meaning of what Friedman means by these assumptions in scarce quotes, right? And he doesn't explain it to us. I mean, that's the problem. Or he doesn't seem to explain it. At least there's no that I explain to you what I mean by assumption in scare quotes and why I use scare quotes. No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't do that. So people said and tried out and said, look, there is no possible meaning for these assumptions. So what does Friedman mean by these assumptions whose descriptive inaccuracy is a virtue? So this is the challenge. If you take that text seriously, you may, of course, assume that Friedman is completely confused and a stupid guy who doesn't know what he's talking about. That's an alternative possibility. A perhaps better possibility is to say, well, let's try to find out. Perhaps he means something serious, although many authors thought doesn't make sense what he's talking about. Okay. Now, a very important point here, there are two different kinds of assumptions in F53, but this is undeclared. And if you don't see that, you have really difficulties understanding. And it took me also a long time to discover that. There are two different kinds of assumptions with scare quotes, but this is undeclared.